Far away in the frozen, endless white of the Arctic, a small scientific station sat quietly, almost invisible under layers of snow and ice. It was a place where very few people ever came. Only the bravest and most curious scientists dared to work there, studying the mysteries hidden deep in the ice and the strange changes happening to the environment. For months, the team had been sending normal reports, data about weather, ice thickness, and animal life. But one cold night, something changed. The station's radio crackled with an urgent broken message that didn't sound quite right. The voice was faint, almost lost in static, but it carried a chilling warning. It wasn't like any distress call anyone had ever heard before. It was short and strange, but it made one thing clear. The people there were in deep trouble. The message said only a few words, repeated over and over. "They're not human. Help, please." And then the signal cut off, leaving only silence and a cold emptiness where the voices had been. Back at the command center, far away from the Arctic, the radio operators stared at their screens, confused and alarmed. The distress signal was unlike any emergency they had ever received. The word sent a shiver through the room. They quickly alerted their superiors. Among those leaders was the fleet commander, a woman who had earned a reputation for being calm, smart, and brave in the face of danger. She wasn't just a military officer. She was someone who believed deeply in protecting people and standing up when others couldn't. When she heard the message, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was no ordinary mission. The commander gathered her team immediately. The urgency was clear. The Arctic was one of the most dangerous places on Earth, and the unknown threat lurking there was beyond anything anyone had prepared for. She looked at her officers, her voice steady but firm. "We don't know what we're facing, but those people need help. Our fleet is going to answer their cry." This fleet was unlike any other. It was called the Cerberus Line, named after the mythical three-headed dog that guarded the gates of the underworld. It was Earth's most powerful and deadly fleet, built to handle the worst crises on the planet. It had the fastest ships, the smartest technology, and the bravest sailors and pilots. But even with all that strength, this mission would test them like never before. As the order came down, the fleet began to prepare. Ships and aircraft moved with quiet precision. Crews packed their gear, ran checks on weapons and communication systems, and studied the briefings about the unknown danger. The atmosphere was tense but focused. Everyone understood that the safety of their fellow humans depended on them. The commander stood on the bridge of the lead ship, watching the radar screens and weather reports. She felt the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. She thought about the scientists out there in the frozen wasteland, alone and scared. She thought about her own family and the families of everyone in her fleet, hoping they would all come back safe. The journey to the Arctic was long and dangerous. The weather was harsh, with biting winds and blinding snowstorms. The sea was rough, with waves that crashed against the hulls of the ships like giant fists. But the fleet pushed forward steady and strong. Along the way, strange things began to happen. The advanced sensors picked up unusual readings. There were electromagnetic signals that seemed to come from nowhere. The skies above the ice sometimes flickered with strange lights dancing like ghosts in the night. The sailors whispered rumors of shadowy shapes moving beneath the ice, too fast and too strange to be normal animals. Despite the growing mystery, the commander kept her team focused. She reminded them that they were there to save lives, no matter the cost. "We will face whatever is out there," she said, "and we will not turn back until the people who sent that cry for help are safe." As the fleet drew closer, the tension grew. The communication with the Arctic station had gone completely silent. No one knew what had happened since that first chilling message. The silence was almost worse than the unknown danger. It left room for the worst fears. Finally, the first ships broke through the thick ice that covered the Arctic waters. The landscape was eerie and quiet. The endless white stretched in every direction, broken only by jagged mountains of ice and frozen waves. The fleet moved carefully, scanning for any sign of life. When they reached the station, the scene was worse than anyone could have imagined. The buildings were damaged, with walls cracked and doors torn off their hinges. Equipment was smashed, and there were strange marks in the snow, deep gouges and strange tracks that no one could explain. It looked like a battle had taken place. The silence was haunting. The rescue teams quickly spread out, calling out to anyone who might be alive. Then, in a nearby cave hidden beneath the ice, they found survivors. Weak, frightened and confused. They told a story that was almost unbelievable. Something had come from beneath the ice. Creatures that moved like shadows and changed their shapes. They were not like anything humans had ever seen. The scientists had tried to study them, but had only made things worse. The creatures had attacked when disturbed. The commander listened carefully. She could see the fear in the survivors' eyes, but also a flicker of hope now that help had arrived. She promised them they would be safe. Back on the fleet's lead ship, the commander and her officers worked through the night, planning their next steps. They knew the danger was far from over. The creatures beneath the ice were still out there, and the team needed to be ready for anything. She thought about the message again. They're not human. Help. It was a warning, yes, but it was also a plea that had brought Earth's most powerful fleet to one of the coldest and most dangerous places on the planet. The fleet was ready to answer. Far away from the icy silence of the Arctic in a large, busy naval base, the world's most powerful fleet was coming to life. This was not just any fleet, it was the Cerberus line, known across the globe as Earth's deadliest force. It had been built for moments exactly like this, moments when the world needed to face dangers that were bigger than anyone could imagine. The base was a hive of activity. Ships and planes lined up like soldiers ready for battle. Every crew member moved with a sense of urgency, but also with focus and discipline. They were trained for this. They had trained their whole lives to be ready to face the unknown. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but also with determination. The people here understood the stakes. The commander stood at the center of the action, watching as the fleet prepared for departure. She wore a simple uniform, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes. She didn't speak much, but when she did, people listened. Her calm presence was a steadying force for the crew. The ships were unlike anything most people had ever seen. Sleek destroyers with dark, almost invisible hulls, built to move fast and strike hard. Submarines that could dive deeper and stay underwater longer than any before them. And above all, the new airships, floating silently through the sky, equipped with the latest technology that allowed them to move faster than sound. Together they formed a network of power, a web that could cover the ocean and the sky. Before the fleet set sail, the commander called her officers together for a briefing. The room was quiet, filled with serious faces. She laid out what little was known about the situation in the Arctic, the strange distress signal, the missing scientists, and the mysterious creatures reported by the survivors. No one knew exactly what they would find. No one knew what dangers awaited beneath the ice or in the frozen caves. But one thing was clear. They had to be ready for anything. The commander's voice was calm but firm. "We don't know what's out there," she said, "but we're going in with the mission to protect and save. We answer every call for help no matter the risk." Her words were met with nods and quiet determination. The fleet was more than just weapons and machines. It was people. People who had families, hopes, and fears. People who believed in something bigger than themselves. They were about to sail into the unknown, carrying the weight of a world hoping for their success. As the ships began to move out of the harbor, the sea around them seemed calm, but the sky was heavy with thick gray clouds. The weather was a reminder that this mission would not be easy. The Arctic was unforgiving. The cold alone could be deadly. On board the lead ship, the commander stood on the bridge, looking out over the dark waters. Her eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon, watching the instruments and listening to the voices of her crew. Each person had a role and each person mattered. The fleet's technology was impressive. Radar systems could detect the smallest movements in the water. Satellites relayed real-time images of the ice and weather. The AI systems helped the crew analyze data and predict dangers. But technology was only part of the story. It was the people behind the controls who would make the difference. Days passed as the fleet pushed closer to the Arctic Circle. The temperature dropped sharply, and the wind grew colder. The sun disappeared behind clouds for days at a time, leaving the sky a pale gray. The ships moved slowly, carefully breaking through thick layers of ice. During these long days and nights, the crew worked in shifts. Some monitored the sensors, others checked the engines, and some simply kept watch, eyes searching the dark horizon for any sign of trouble. The silence of the sea was broken only by the sounds of engines and the occasional radio chatter. As they moved further north, the strange signs began to appear. The radar showed unusual signals, small, fast-moving objects beneath the ice. The weather systems behaved oddly. with sudden changes that no one could explain. At night, the sky lit up with strange colors, green and purple waves dancing across the horizon. Some of the sailors whispered stories about the Arctic being haunted, or home to creatures from another world. The commander heard these whispers but kept her focus. She knew that fear could be a dangerous thing, but so could underestimating the unknown. One evening, the communications officer came rushing to the bridge with urgent news. The sensors had picked up a large movement beneath the ice, something massive and moving quickly. The entire crew on the bridge became alert. This was not a normal animal or ice shift. The commander ordered all ships to prepare for possible contact. Every crew member double-checked their equipment. The pilots ran through flight checks for the airships. The submarines adjusted their course to get closer to the source without being detected. The tension was electric. Everyone felt it. The moment when the unknown would finally reveal itself. Suddenly, a scout drone sent back images that froze the room in shock. On the screen, strange shapes moved beneath the ice. They were not like any fish or sea creatures. They were fluid and shifting like shadows come to life. The forms seemed to change shape and move with purpose. The crew stared at the screen in disbelief. It was clear now that the survivors' stories had been true. Whatever was beneath the ice was unlike anything humanity had seen. The commander took a deep breath and spoke to her crew with calm authority. "This is what we came for. Stay sharp, stay together." We answer this cry for help not just with force, but with courage. The fleet moved closer to the area where the distress signal had originated. The ice cracked under the pressure of the heavy ships. The sea was cold and dark, but the crew was ready. That night, as the ships settled into position, the commander walked among her crew. She saw tired faces, worried faces, but also faces full of resolve. She stopped to speak with a young technician who was monitoring the communications. The technician's hands were steady, but the fear in her eyes was clear. "You're doing great," the commander said quietly. "Remember why we're here. We're not just fighting an enemy. We're fighting to save people who can't save themselves." The technician nodded, feeling the weight of the mission but also the strength of leadership. The days ahead would be long and difficult. The mystery beneath the ice was still unsolved and the danger was growing. But for now, the fleet was ready to face whatever came next. They were Earth's most deadly fleet, yes, but they were also Earth's last hope. After days of traveling through icy waters and battling freezing winds, the fleet finally reached the area where the distress call had come from. The sea was no longer open water but a frozen maze of sharp ice sheets and towering glaciers. The ships carefully navigated this dangerous path, each movement slow and deliberate as one wrong turn could trap a vessel in ice for good. The silence of the Arctic was heavy. The cold bit deep and even the sun seemed weak, barely breaking through thick clouds. The only sounds were the engines of the ships cutting through the frozen sea and the crackling radios. Every crew member was alert, watching, listening, waiting for something to happen. As they moved closer, the crew saw the remains of the scientific outpost. What was once a place buzzing with life and research now looked abandoned and destroyed. Walls were cracked, windows shattered, and equipment lay scattered across the snow, broken and frozen. The harsh winds had already begun to erase signs of struggle, covering footprints and broken objects with fresh layers of snow. The rescue teams were the first to step onto the ice. They called out, but no answer came. The air was cold and still, and the only reply was the sound of their own voices echoing against the frozen landscape. It felt like the station was holding its breath, waiting. In the distance, they spotted movement near a small ice cave. Approaching carefully, they found the survivors, the last few members of the team who had sent the warning. They were cold, weak, and scared, but alive. Their faces told a story of terror and confusion. One survivor explained in a shaky voice that strange creatures had appeared suddenly. At first, the scientists thought they were just animals, maybe new species disturbed by climate change. But soon they realized these beings were different, something no one could explain. The creatures moved quickly and silently, changing shapes and hiding in shadows. They didn't seem to be from this world. The survivors said the creatures came from beneath the ice. Some of the team had tried to study them, but the creatures fought back fiercely. The outpost was attacked, and many were lost or forced to flee. The commander listened carefully to the survivors' stories. She knew they were frightened and confused, but she could see the truth in their eyes. This was no ordinary emergency. This was something new and dangerous, something they had to understand before it was too late. The rescue team worked quickly to warm the survivors and bring them aboard the ships. Medical officers checked their conditions, treating frostbite and shock. The survivors needed rest, safety, and answers. At the same time, the fleet began scanning the area with all their advanced technology. Radar, sonar, and thermal imaging were used to search beneath the ice. The machines detected strange movements, fast and silent beneath the frozen water. Suddenly, during one scan, a stealth destroyer lost contact. The ship had been sent closer to the edge of the ice to get a better look, but now all signals were gone. The fleet held its breath as they tried to re-establish communication. The ship's captain managed to send a quick message before silence fell. "Under attack. Something beneath. Pulling us down." Then the line went dead. The commander knew the danger had become very real and very close. She ordered the rest of the fleet to prepare for immediate action. The calm professionalism of the crew was replaced by urgency. The mysterious creatures were not just hiding. They were actively attacking. The fleet moved into position, ready to defend themselves and protect the survivors. Everyone knew the next hours would be critical. The airship soared above, scanning the ice with infrared and radar. Submarines dived beneath the surface, trying to find the source of the attacks. The destroyers readied their defenses, prepared for the fight ahead. As the battle began, the fleet quickly learned that these creatures were unlike any enemy they had faced before. They moved through water and ice like ghosts, disappearing and reappearing in an instant. Their shapes seemed to flow and change, confusing the sensors and the sailors alike. The creatures attacked silently but with great strength. They pulled on cables, tore at hulls, and caused the sea to churn violently. The ice cracked and shifted under the pressure of the fight. Despite the danger, the crew fought bravely. The airships dropped non-lethal nets designed to trap but not harm, hoping to capture a specimen for study. The submarines launched sonar pulses to track movement, and the destroyers fired warning shots trying to keep the creatures at bay without provoking full destruction. But the creatures were intelligent. They learned quickly and adapted their attacks. It became clear they were defending their home, whatever that home was beneath the ice. In the chaos, the commander made a difficult decision. This was not a simple battle between enemies. It was a conflict born from fear and misunderstanding. The creatures were not just monsters, they were beings reacting to an intrusion. She ordered her officers to try a different approach: communication. Using a series of harmonic pulses and visual signals, the fleet attempted to send peaceful messages, hoping to reach the creatures in a way words could not. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, to everyone's surprise, the creatures responded, not with violence but with patterns of light and sound. It was a language, strange and unfamiliar, but it was there. The survivors from the outpost watched as the fleet and the creatures began this silent conversation. Their hope grew. Maybe this could end without more bloodshed. The commander and her team worked through the night, trying to understand the patterns. Slowly, they learned that the creatures had been disturbed by the presence of humans drilling and experimenting in the ice. The outpost's research had unintentionally awakened them from a deep sleep. These creatures were part of a hidden ecosystem beneath the ice, living quietly for centuries. They had no intention of attacking humans until they were threatened. The fleet's mission had changed. It was no longer just about rescue and defense. It was now about respect and understanding. As dawn broke over the frozen horizon, the commander stood on the deck of her ship, looking out at the vast white wilderness. The danger was still there, but so was hope. She thought about the fragile balance between humanity and nature, and the unknown worlds waiting beneath the surface of our planet. The cry for help was answered, but the real challenge was just beginning. The fleet had not only faced a deadly threat, but had also learned a powerful lesson. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in fighting, but in listening. The fleet had arrived at the edge of the frozen wilderness, and the unexpected silence that followed the first contact with the strange creatures weighed heavily on everyone. The battle had stopped, but the tension remained thick in the air. No one knew what would happen next. The creatures beneath the ice had responded, not with violence but with signals of light and sound, a language unknown and mysterious. The commander stood quietly on the deck of her ship, watching the ice stretch endlessly around them. She thought about the survivors they had rescued, the missing outpost and the dangerous unknown that lay beneath. What had started as a mission to save people had now become a mission to understand something completely new. Her mind was filled with questions. How long had these creatures lived under the ice? What did they want? Were they intelligent? What would happen if humans and these beings tried to live side by side? As the sun rose weakly over the horizon, the crew began their work to communicate. Using the fleet's advanced technology, they sent back signals that matched the patterns they had received from the creatures. It was slow and difficult work. The signals were like a code, made up of rhythms and colors that no one had seen before. The scientists aboard the lead ship worked around the clock, trying to decode the language. They watched carefully for any sign of understanding or response. The tension was broken only by the hope that maybe this was the start of something new, an understanding between two very different forms of life. Meanwhile, the survivors of the outpost, now safe but still weak, gathered with the fleet's medical teams. They shared more stories of the creatures beneath the ice, the way they moved, the strange sounds they made, and how they seemed to watch without blinking. The survivors spoke of fear, but also of awe. They had seen something impossible, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about life on Earth. One of the survivors described how the creatures seemed to be part of the ice itself, moving through cracks and tunnels as if they belonged there. They seemed connected to the frozen world, and their anger had only come when the scientists disturbed the delicate balance by drilling and digging. The commander listened carefully. It was clear that the creatures were not evil or mindless. They were guardians of their world, protecting a home that humans had accidentally invaded. Back on the ships, the fleet continued their attempts at communication. Slowly, patterns emerged. The creatures seemed curious but cautious. They responded more when the signals were gentle and respectful, but they stopped when the messages became loud or aggressive. The crew learned an important lesson. This was not a battle to be won by force. It was a delicate dance of respect and understanding. One of the younger crew members, a technician responsible for the signal patterns, found herself fascinated by the creature's language. She spent hours watching the screen, trying to match the rhythms and colors. She noticed that some patterns repeated like words, while others seemed like questions or warnings. Her dedication inspired the whole team. It reminded them that behind the fear and danger, there was a chance to make peace. The commander decided to send a small team on a special mission. They would try to get closer to the creature's home beneath the ice, not to fight, but to observe and learn. The team was made up of scientists and sailors trained in survival and diplomacy. They would carry equipment to record everything and tools to communicate. As the team prepared, the fleet strengthened its defenses but held back from further attacks. The goal was clear: protect, observe, and understand. The journey beneath the ice was unlike anything the team had ever experienced. They traveled through tunnels carved by ancient waters where light barely reached and the cold was deeper than anywhere on the surface. Strange sounds echoed through the caverns, soft whispers like voices carried by the wind. The team carefully moved forward, their lights scanning the shadows. Suddenly, shapes began to appear, silent, shifting forms that seemed to watch from the darkness. The creatures were unlike anything the team had imagined. Flowing bodies made of ice and water, eyes that glowed faintly, and movements that were both graceful and powerful. Despite the fear, the team felt a deep connection growing. They saw signs of a complex society. Structures made of ice, patterns carved into walls, and symbols that hinted at stories and history. The team used their communication devices to send the peaceful signals learned from the fleet. To their surprise, some creatures responded by moving closer, showing no signs of aggression. It was a moment of fragile trust. The commander back on the surface followed every moment with intense focus. She knew this was a turning point. If this small team could prove that peace was possible, it would change everything. Over the following days, the team sent back more information. The creature's world was ancient and full of secrets. They had survived through ice ages and changes no human had ever seen. They were part of the Earth's deep history, but the presence of humans and their machines was dangerous to this fragile world. The creatures were not attacking out of hate. They were defending a home that could not survive being broken apart. The commander made a decision to limit the fleet's activities in the area. The drilling and heavy equipment would stop. The mission's focus shifted entirely to protection and study. Back on the ships, the crew felt a sense of relief, but also a new respect for the unknown. They had come as warriors but stayed as learners. They realized that strength was not only about weapons and power, but about understanding and respect. The survivors from the outpost began to recover, sharing their stories and working with the scientists to learn more about the creatures. They became part of the new effort to protect the Arctic and its secrets. The commander stood on the deck one evening, looking out at the endless ice. The sky was clear, and the northern lights danced softly above. She thought about the journey that had brought them here, from a cry for help to a story of connection between two worlds. The fleet was ready to stay, not just to protect, but to listen and learn. The Arctic was no longer just a frozen desert. It was a place of life, mystery, and fragile peace. The mission was far from over. The creatures beneath the ice were still there, watching and waiting. But now they were no longer enemies. They were part of a story about hope, a story about how humans could find new ways to live with the unknown. The commander smiled quietly. Earth's most deadly fleet had answered a cry for help, but in doing so, it had discovered something even greater: the power of understanding and the courage to face the unknown together. After the peaceful first contact with the creatures beneath the ice, the fleet settled into a new rhythm. They were no longer just warriors or rescuers. They had become explorers and diplomats in a strange, frozen world that few people had ever seen. The change was difficult for many. The crew was trained to fight threats, not to negotiate or study unknown beings. But everyone understood that this mission was bigger than themselves. The days passed slowly in the Arctic cold. The ships held position, creating a circle around the ice cave where the creatures lived. The scientists and technicians worked non-stop, translating the strange language of lights and sounds the creatures used. It was a puzzle that sometimes frustrated the best minds on board, but they kept going. Below the ice, the small team continued its careful journey through the frozen tunnels and caverns. They learned more about the creatures' world, a place both beautiful and fragile. The ice around them glittered with ancient crystals, and strange plants glowed faintly in the dark. It was clear this hidden world had been untouched for thousands of years. The creatures themselves moved with a calm grace, as if part of the ice and water. The team noticed they had families, communities, and rituals. They were intelligent and deeply connected to their environment. One evening, the team discovered something unexpected: a chamber filled with glowing crystals, arranged in patterns like a map. The crystals seemed to pulse softly, as if alive. The team carefully studied the crystals and realized they held information: stories, histories, even warnings about the dangers of the outside world. The team shared their discovery with the commander and the scientists on the surface. It was a breakthrough. The crystals were like a library, offering a glimpse into a world that humans could barely understand. Back on the ships, the atmosphere was a mix of excitement and tension. Everyone felt the weight of responsibility. The Arctic was no longer just a battlefield or a rescue zone. It was a place where two worlds met, and the future depended on respect and care. The commander gathered her officers for a meeting. They discussed how to protect this fragile world and what steps to take next. The answer was clear: they needed to keep the peace and learn as much as possible. At the same time, they had to prepare for any threats, whether from nature or human mistakes. Meanwhile, the survivors of the outpost were recovering slowly. They shared their stories with the crew, describing the early days before the creatures had shown themselves. They spoke of the excitement and hope they had felt when they first came to the Arctic to study the ice and climate. But their work had disturbed the creatures' world, causing fear and conflict. Some survivors struggled with guilt. They had come with the best intentions but had unknowingly caused harm. The commander spoke to them gently, reminding them that mistakes were part of discovery. What mattered now was how they moved forward. The young technician who had become fascinated by the creature's language played a key role. She helped create a new system to communicate more clearly. This system used simple patterns and colors that the creatures seemed to understand better. One day, the technician received a message unlike any before, a clear sequence of lights that seemed to be a greeting or invitation. It was a sign that the creatures wanted to take a step closer in their relationship with the humans. They Commander quickly organized a meeting between the small team beneath the ice and the leaders of the creatures. It was a historic moment, the first true meeting between two very different forms of life. The meeting was held in a large ice chamber lit by the glowing crystals. The creatures appeared around the room like shimmering shadows. The humans stood carefully, showing respect and holding their hands open in peace. For a long time, neither side spoke. Communication came through the patterns of light and sound, and through gestures and calm presence. Slowly, trust began to grow. The creatures shared their story. They explained that their kind had lived beneath the ice for centuries, guarding the planet's fragile balance. They had survived great changes and had the power to influence the environment in ways humans could not understand. They expressed concern about the damage caused by drilling and human activity. They also feared what might happen if other humans came with less respect or more weapons. The humans, in turn, shared their own story, the urgency of climate change, the need to study and protect the planet, and their hope that this meeting would mark a new beginning. The commander spoke clearly and honestly. She promised that the fleet would protect the Arctic, and that the scientists would work carefully to avoid harm. The meeting ended with a quiet agreement and understanding that both sides would work together to protect the fragile world beneath the ice. Back on the surface, the fleet began to change its mission. Heavy equipment was removed from the area, and new rules were created to prevent damage. The ships became guardians watching over the ice and the creatures' home. The crew felt a deep sense of purpose. They were part of something important, something bigger than any battle or rescue mission. They were protectors of a secret world, and their duty was to keep it safe. The survivors helped spread this new message. They spoke to the world about the creatures beneath the ice, not as monsters, but as neighbors. Their stories inspired others to think differently about the Arctic and the planet. The fleet's presence brought new hope to the region. Scientists from around the world joined the effort to study the creatures and their environment with care. They shared knowledge, technology, and respect for the unknown. But challenges remained. The Arctic was still dangerous. The weather was harsh and the ice shifted unpredictably. The creatures were still cautious and the balance was fragile. One night, the fleet's radar detected a storm moving rapidly toward the ice cave. The winds howled and the temperature dropped even further. The storm threatened both the fleet and the creatures' home. The commander ordered everyone to prepare for the worst. The ships moved to shield the ice cave as best they could. The crew worked together, securing equipment, helping the survivors, and staying ready for any emergency. The storm was fierce. Ice cracked and shifted. Waves crashed against the ships and visibility dropped to near zero. The crew stayed calm and focused, trusting their training and each other. After hours of battling the storm, the winds finally began to die down. The fleet was battered but intact. The creatures had retreated to safer places within the ice. In the quiet that followed, the commander walked along the deck, thinking about the fragile world they were protecting. The storm was a reminder that nature was powerful and unpredictable. It did not care about human plans or machines. She thought about the future. The fleet's mission was no longer just about answering a cry for help. It was about listening to the planet, respecting its mysteries, and working together with the unknown. The young technician stood beside her, watching the calm sea. She smiled and said, "We came here ready to fight, but what we found was so much more." The commander nodded. "This is only the beginning. There's a whole world beneath the ice waiting for us to understand." The fleet would stay. They would watch, learn, and protect. They were Earth's most deadly fleet, yes, but now they were Earth's most careful guardians. The fleet had been in the Arctic for many weeks now. What began as a mission to rescue and fight had changed completely. Now it was about understanding and protecting a hidden world beneath the ice. The crew had faced danger, mystery, and fear, and through it all, they had learned something important: respect for life, even when it was very different from their own. The small team that had ventured beneath the ice returned with new discoveries. They brought back recordings of the glowing creatures moving through their frozen tunnels. They shared stories of their meetings and how peaceful these beings could be when treated with care. Back on the surface, the crew worked together with the survivors and scientists. The fleet's ships stayed close, guarding the fragile ice from any harm. They were no longer just war machines, they were protectors, watching over a secret world. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the Arctic sky lit up with colorful lights, the commander stood on the deck, thinking about everything that had happened. The silence around her was deep, filled with the sound of the wind and the slow creaking of the ice. She remembered the first day they had arrived, the cold, the fear, and the unknown danger. Now she saw a new future, one where humans and the creatures beneath the ice could live together, not as enemies but as neighbors. The scientists worked on translating more of the creatures' language. Each day the patterns of light and sound revealed new ideas, messages about balance, survival, and respect for nature. The creatures showed they had memories of Earth's past, times when ice covered much more of the planet and when the world was very different. The fleet began sharing these lessons with the outside world. They broadcast messages to global leaders, scientists, and the public. The story of the creatures beneath the ice became a symbol of hope and a reminder of how much there still was to learn about Earth. Not everyone was happy. Some people feared the unknown, wanting to push forward with drilling and mining, but the commander and her crew stood firm. They used the evidence and the stories from the survivors to protect the area. They reminded everyone that this place was not just frozen land. It was a living, breathing world. On one quiet morning, the crew spotted something new, a thin crack in the ice, wider than before. It looked like the ice was shifting faster than anyone expected. Scientists warned that climate change was making the Arctic more unstable, threatening both the creatures' home and the fleet's safety. The commander knew that this was a critical moment. They had to act quickly to protect the fragile balance. The fleet called in support from environmental groups and scientific experts around the world. Together, they planned ways to monitor and preserve the Arctic. As days passed, the creatures themselves seemed to sense the changes. They moved closer to the surface, sending new signals that were stronger and more urgent. The fleet responded with calm but careful actions, sending messages of reassurance and offering help. One night, under the shimmering northern lights, a special event happened. The creatures gathered near the ice cave, creating a beautiful light show, a dance of colors and shapes that filled the dark sky. The fleet's crew watched in awe, understanding that this was a gift, a way of saying thank you and a promise of friendship. The young technician who had helped decode the language felt tears in her eyes. She thought about how far they had come, from fear and battle to peace and wonder. The creatures had taught them something that no textbook ever could: the power of patience, respect, and connection. The commander knew that their mission was far from over. The Arctic would continue to change and challenges would arise. But now, humans and the creatures beneath the ice had something stronger than weapons or technology. They had trust. The fleet began training new teams to work in the Arctic with care and respect. They shared their knowledge, teaching others how to listen to the planet and protect its mysteries. The story of this mission inspired many, reminding people that Earth's greatest strength was in its diversity and balance. Back on the ships, the crew shared moments of quiet reflection. They talked about their homes and families, about the world beyond the ice, and about what they had learned here. Each person carried a new sense of responsibility, a promise to be guardians of the unknown. One evening, as the fleet prepared to leave the Arctic for a while, the commander looked out at the horizon. The creatures had disappeared back into the depths of their ice world, but the bond remained strong. She thought about the future. A future where humans would no longer rush blindly into unknown places, but would first seek to understand and protect. A future where the planet's secrets were treated with care, and where every cry for help was answered not just with force, but with heart. As the ships turned away from the frozen landscape, the commander smiled quietly. The fleet had answered the cry for help, but more than that, they had found a new way to live with the planet, and with each other. The story of the fleet and the creatures beneath the ice would live on, a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest places, hope could shine bright.